Dr. Rob Mazant. I am a psychologist that works with Oliver Behavioral Consultants, and I'm going to be presenting tonight on IEP rights and law information. So this is intended to be an informational session about individualized education plans. So both a bit about the process of going through and developing an IEP, as well as some resources for parents that may need support in doing so. As I mentioned, this is intended to be an introductory session. So if you come away from this webinar with more questions or thinking about how would this relate to my family specifically, that's fantastic. What we would urge you to do is to have an appointment, a consultation appointment or a therapy appointment with someone at Oliver Behavioral Consultants, as we can help to guide you through that. We are also happy to refer you to educational advocacy groups as well if that's a route that you want to pursue. Okay, so first thing that I want to clarify is what an IEP is. So an IEP stands for an Individualized Education Plan. And this is one of two main advocacy tools, or I should say legal tools, that a family has to help their child who may have a disability. And I want to talk briefly about the difference between these two laws and kind of where they came from and what they cover. And then I'll focus the rest of this presentation on IEP specifically. So IEPs, or Individualized Education Plans, come from the US Department of Education. So they stem from a federal education law. And they are a legal contract that a parent creates with a school district to provide more unique or individualized educational experiences. And I'm speaking kind of broadly here because IEPs, because they're individualized, they are really broad in the way that they are developed. But largely, these are legal contracts that exist to modify, alter, or enhance the educational presentation and to individualize the education experience for an individual. And it's kind of codified or spelled out in this legal document. A 504 plan is also a legal document, but it comes from a different law and is managed by a different arm of the federal government. So the Office of Civil Rights oversees the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And what this law, I'm going to take this beautifully written complex law and truncate it down into like one sentence. But basically what it is it is a legal tool that's designed to protect the rights of individuals with disabilities in programs and activities that receive any federal funding from the US. And specific to kids in the educational system, what this means is that kids that have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life function can seek accommodation from the facility or the entity at which they are attending. So one way I kind of remember the difference between the two is that a 504 plan would likely be used to create or provide a ramp for people that struggle with ambulatory walking to be able to enter into the school. So if somebody was unable to walk into the school and they couldn't climb steps, they essentially wouldn't be able to access the school. A Section 504 plan would provide a stair lift or would provide a ramp, something to facilitate or accommodate accessing the school. What it wouldn't allow a participant to do is to modify the expectations, the educational expectations, or the school content, the learning content at school. That's more for an individualized education plan. Using another example, let's say you have a child that has some executive functioning disability. Through the 504 plan, if you just needed some extra supports, like maybe an extra set of books at home, that's likely something that you could seek an accommodation you could seek under a 504 plan. If you're substantially changing the educational delivery for that kid, though, you probably need to go with an IEP. Either way, they're both legally binding documents, And I'm going to move forward with the rest of this presentation talking more specifically about IEPs. Okay, so as I mentioned, IEPs come from a federal law, and that federal law is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA. This was reauthorized or tweaked and kind of reavowed in 2004. And that's the most current legal standing we have for implementing IDEA. And one of the things that IDEA does is it really emphasizes the essentialness of parents in the educational process and the rights that parents have to make education more effective for their child. It also affirms that parents have the right to examine all records relating to their child until their child reaches the age of legal majority, which for most kids is 18. And this is further explained in the FERPA Act, or the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. This is a law that protects the educational records of all students, regardless of whether there's any disability status or not. It protects the privacy of their educational record. So up until the point of kids becoming legal agents of themselves, parents have a right to this. Once they pass the age of 18 or legal majority, then parents don't have the right to any educational records thereafter. One of the terms that's really important to understand, and is kind of this bedrock term in IDEA, is the term FAPE, or a free and appropriate public education. One of the kind of core tenets of our educational system, and one of the things that the U.S. Department of Education really strives to do, is to ensure that all children have access to and have the right to a free and appropriate public education. So educational services are provided at the public expense through taxpayer monies and under the public supervision and direction without charge to any families. Anytime that we want to make an adjustment to this, we need to do so in a way that brings all parties on board. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in a later slide, but another term that I'll go over is something called the least restrictive environment. So what that means is that all children are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. What appropriate means is kind of determined at a state-by-state level. So states have kind of different educational standards that they meet at different times. And kids are allowed to receive this education in the least restrictive way. The reverse of that, though, is if we need to modify what appropriate is for an individual, we need to do so in a way that is legally appropriate. And I'll get into what that process of legal appropriateness is. But the department that oversees that is the Department for Special Education. And there are a few things that I want to talk about. So if a child qualifies for special education, then the things that they qualify for, the needs that they have, are written into this legal document called an Individualized Education Program. And the IEP describes any modifications to that standard appropriate public education. And it also describes any kind of additional services that a child might need to proceed appropriately through their educational experience. So this could be things like speech services, mental health services, behavioral services, etc. In the not so recent past, in 2018, there was also a notable Supreme Court decision that really clarified for schools, and this actually was a school in Colorado near us that was part of this court case, but that the way schools deliver treatment has to be aligned with what's considered best quality implementation, meaning schools can't just decide how they want to implement things kind of on their own. They have to meet like a best practice standard. And so really there is a lot of kind of legal guideline and recourse for families that help them to feel empowered in getting an education that feels appropriate for their family. Okay, so I started to mention this, which is, as I said, is part of that free and appropriate public education. That's the concept of the least restrictive environment, or the LRE. So districts are required by law to educate all students in an environment that is as least restrictive as is appropriate. Before students can get something more restrictive than the standard, they have to qualify for that service. And they qualify for that service through the special education departments of various districts. So if a student needs special classes, specialized instruction, a separate school, or anything that would modify or remove a child from the regular education environment, the school has to first consider providing supplementary aids and services to support success in the regular classroom. So we're not going to jump to the most restrictive first unless there's really, really compelling evidence that that is needed. Rather, it's going to be kind of a stair-step approach. We're going to try what's least restrictive first and only get more and more restrictive as it becomes apparent that a child needs that to be educationally successful. Another thing that I want to mention is a concept called the extended school year, or ESY. This is important for families to know about because extended school year services are a service provided free of charge for families by the school, and they are presented over the summer. So essentially, kids continue on in their education even when school is closed for most students, so in that summer period. And the reason why this is that there's been some really fantastic research showing that for many students, and particularly students with a disability, that there is summer learning loss. So during the period of time where kids are on break from school, and we see this mostly during the summer block, where there's this kind of extended period of time where kids are not in school routinely, that many kids have some summer learning loss, or they have some regression from where they ended school to the next year starting school. And this regression, or this learning loss, seems to be a bit more for students with a disability. And not only that, but it takes them longer to make up that loss. And so without extended school year, so without additional educational services, over time, when you multiply that out by 13 years, that gap between them and the typically developing kids in their same grade becomes greater and greater and greater. So extended school year is a service that can be put into a child's IEP. This is something that the IEP team, or the special education team, the committee, will determine, and it's determined every year. What level of determination is required, or what level of data is required to determine if extended school year is needed, it varies by district, but you would work with your special education committee to find out if your child would qualify for that. It may not be exactly like a regular school day, but the whole intent of this is to help to remediate or prevent some of that summer learning loss from compounding over time. Okay. Let's start to get into the meat of how one would go about getting an individualized education plan. So the initial step is that a student is referred for an evaluation. And that evaluation is intended to determine whether special services are needed for this child. So saying this another way, we determine if a child is eligible for special education services. Do they qualify for these services under a designated classification? Presuming that they are, let's say after the evaluations are completed, a team convenes. And this team can be called the IEP team. It can also be called the Committee for Special Education team, but they convene to go over all of the information and say, yes, this child does qualify for special education services, or no, this child doesn't qualify for special education services. If they do, then an IEP, an individualized education plan, which is a legal document, is written. So when I say it's written, it means it's developed with this team, written with this team, and when the team reaches a consensus that yes, this is the way to move forward for this kid, then it is a signed contract that's enacted right after it's signed. Regardless of when a child's IEP is created, every 3 years, an entire reevaluation is done. And the reason for this is that, let's say a kiddo has an IEP, they're determined to be eligible for an IEP when they're 4. We know developmentally a 4-year-old is very different than a 7-year-old, and is different from a 10-year-old, 13-year-old, a 16-year-old, and so forth. And so every 3 years that an evaluation, the whole thing is redone, and that team reconvenes to say, does this child still qualify for special education services? Are they making appropriate gains? Do we need to modify substantially this contract? It essentially goes through a rewrite every 3 years. Separate from that, every year, the team meets to check in on that contract and to say, do we need to make any small tweaks here? Another thing that's helpful for parents to know is that the school provides these evaluations. And I'm going to go in just a few minutes into the time frame for these evaluations and what the evaluations cover and what they don't cover. But if parents want to or opt to get an independent education evaluation, so they may go to get this done privately, they have the right to do this at any time. In certain circumstances, the school may pay for it, but the majority of the time, this would be something that families pay for privately. But whether they pay for it privately or the school pays for it, they are allowed to bring this information to the IEP meeting, to the IEP team, and the information within an independent evaluation has to be considered by this IEP team. Okay, so the IEP team players, again, also called the Committee for Special Education, who the team players are. I'm using these terms interchangeably. So who is part of this? One, the student has a right to be part of it, particularly as the student gets older, and many a times by the time the student is reaching their teen years, it's really important that they start to become a part of this process and understand what their contract says and what their legal rights are and aren't, and that they take a role in self-advocacy. The younger the child is, it becomes less appropriate. But it's certainly, if the parent would like the child to be part of it, they are welcome to be. The student's parent or legal guardian is also part of the IEP team. And I mentioned a few slides ago how this educational law really emphasizes the role of parents' rights in this process, and also the necessity of parent involvement. This process cannot move forward if parents don't consent to it. I should say that's a mostly true statement. If a child's educational progress is really, really impacted by a presumed disability and parents won't consent to it, there are some advocacy that the school might try to do, or some legal things, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this talk. But generally, for most of us, this is something that parents consent to. They, in writing, show their willingness to have their child undergo an evaluation and to be considered for this process, and they become an essential member of the IEP team or the CSE team. Another person who is a part of the IEP team is a regular education teacher. So a regular education teacher is and must be, it's required that they're included as a member of the team. And then they can give voice to what's a typical environment or a typical expectation for kids in a given grade level. And so they kind of speak to both least restrictive environment, but also how the student is progressing compared to to CNH peers. Another required member is a school district representative. And this representative, who it is exactly will vary district to district, but most commonly it's like a program specialist or behavior specialist or a school psychologist, but somebody who's quite knowledgeable about the programs and the resources offered by the district. Other individuals who may have knowledge or expertise of the child will be included in this team meeting. And then lastly, something that's important for families to know is that they always have the right to bring in outside people to become part of the IEP team. So they could bring in a behavioral consultant, a therapist, an educational advocate, another type of service provider to help them to understand the IEP process, to help them to interpret test scores and things of the like, to help give their opinion on the quality of the recommendations that are being made, and to just generally help the parent advocate and provide emotional support for them. So if parents feel unfamiliar with the IEP process, this is one of the things we recommend very highly, is that they bring a support person in with them to become part of the IEP team to help them advocate. Okay, this slide here is the Individualized Education Program. The I is important, and that's really true because the I stands for individualized. This is intended to be a contract, a program that is tailored and unique to a child's specific needs and ability. Once this document is created, and this document outlines every aspect of their educational plan, it becomes a legally binding document that schools are required to follow. And this is true whether you move districts or you even move to another state. It is the document that says, my child is entitled to accessing a free and appropriate public education. And for my child, this is what appropriate means. And this document, how it's put together will vary a little bit district to district, and it'll vary in kind of presentation, like what the contract looks like state to state. But even if you move across states, the things that are listed here are typically part of every IEP. So one is either diagnosis or classification. Kids do not have to have a medical diagnosis or a mental health diagnosis, for example, to receive an IEP. They can classify or be qualified under one of the given educational classifications, and I'll go into those in just a moment. There will be a statement about why the child is eligible for the services that are listed for them in this document. There are going to be specific measurable goals in this document. There are going to be a list of the specific accommodations that the child is entitled to. There's going to be clarity around how the curriculum will be modified specifically for this individual child. They will make clear the amount of time, down to the minute, that a child is to receive supplementary services to progress educationally. There will be a statement about the least restrictive environment and what type of environment that a kiddo should be in. Whether or not they are eligible for state testing. Regardless of this, parents always have the option to opt out, but sometimes that's determined in the IEP. And then whether or not the child qualifies for extended school year will be in the IEP. Okay, so the classifications that I mentioned, or the reasons, the areas under which a child could qualify for an individualized education plan are listed here. So these include autism spectrum disorder, deaf-blindness, developmental delays, hearing impairments, intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairments, other health impairments, serious emotional disability, speech or language impairments, traumatic brain injury, visual impairments. So to qualify for an IEP, A student has to meet the definition of one of these listed classifications. One thing that I want to make clear to families, and that can be really confusing sometimes for families, is that the educational system is a system. It has its own rules and its own labels and its own terms. The medical system, the mental health system, is a different system. It has different legal requirements, oftentimes different labels. And if you picture these as two separate systems, like with the circles with my hand, it's like a Venn diagram. There's some overlap in there, but there are some things that are unique to each of those systems. A child does not have to have a mental health diagnosis or a medical diagnosis to qualify for an IEP. A child with a medical diagnosis or a mental health diagnosis may qualify for an IEP under one of these classification areas. But I have worked with families for a long time, and I'm going to use an example. Let's say we have a child who has a diagnosis of conduct disorder. So they are struggling with their behavioral conduct. That's a mental health diagnosis term. That's not any of these classifications, but the child would probably qualify likely under the serious emotional disability classification, which is an educational term. It's an educational classification. It's not a diagnosis. But I've had families feel very frustrated because they'll say, man, I've been to so many mental health providers or psychologists or doctors, and nobody's ever told me before that my child has a diagnosis of a serious emotional disability. And they're just kind of confusing the terms because there's two separate systems. And it's hard for families, it's hard for parents because they have to suddenly become experts in like multiple or many different systems in the language that they use. Along with that, schools do not have the right to diagnose any medical disorders or mental health disorders. Their role as an educational entity is to provide education. So they can determine, based on a lot of information that's gathered, if a child will qualify for services under one of these classification areas, but they won't make a diagnosis for your child. So they may recommend that you seek an outside opinion, but they can't force you to, and they also independently will not make a diagnosis. I hope that clears things up a little bit. These are kind of two separate systems that have two different types of languages or terms or labels that they use, and they don't perfectly overlap. Okay, some timelines that are important for families to be mindful of. If you think that your child may need an individualized education plan or may need some specialized services from the school, the very first thing that has to happen is that a referral is made to the special education department within the district. When that referral is made, a parent has to consent to it. Now, if a parent is the one making the referral, they are by default giving their consent. But if somebody else makes the referral, like a teacher, for instance, even though the teacher may make that referral, the parent has to sign a consent form saying, yes, I'm willing to go through this process. They're not saying, yes, I'm willing for my child to automatically go into special education or to have an IEP, but they're saying, I'm willing to go through the process of finding out. And a parent at any point can opt out of this process. For families that I typically work with, when I serve as an advocate, this is not the area of concern that they often have. Often they want services for their kiddos and they want to see if their child qualifies for an IEP, and they may feel frustrated with, how do I start this process? So how you start the process is you make a referral. A referral is something that needs to be made in writing and submitted. And I always advise families to submit with a timestamp. So if you're sending a physical letter, pay the extra money to have it sent by certified mail. So you have a timestamp of when that letter is received. If you're sending it by electronic mail, you probably should have a timestamp of when it was actually sent. And oftentimes you can see when the receiving party has opened it and received it. The reason why this timestamp is important is because there are legally defined timelines for how fast or how urgently a school has to respond to a request for an evaluation. In the state of Colorado, this slide here comes from the Colorado Department of Education. Once a referral is made and parents give their consent for an evaluation, that evaluation has to happen within 60 days. So sometimes it can be frustrating for families to feel like they request an evaluation and then a couple of months go by. But legally, schools do have a couple of months to get that done. They have 60 days to get that done. So when I say get the evaluation done, what that means is to do whatever information gathering needs to happen, and then to have a meeting. And in that meeting, eligibility will be determined. That process has to happen within 60 days. If it is the parent that is making the request or the referral for an evaluation, I always ask parents to list out all of the reasons why they are requesting the referral. Because if you are the person in charge of the referral and you receive and it says very little information, it's sometimes hard to know where to start and stop with what to evaluate for this kiddo. Certainly there are guidelines around it, but we ask that parents be as specific with their concerns as possible to make sure that the evaluation will cover all the areas of concern that they have. As you see here in this graphic, during that 60-day period, a parent also will be given notice of when the meeting is to be held. A parent has every right to be at that meeting. So for whatever reason, if the parent cannot be at the meeting but wants to, that meeting cannot proceed without the parent's presence. So that meeting may need to get rescheduled, that eligibility meeting, and you can work with the school to do so. But it cannot proceed without the parent being present if the parent wants to be there. The parent can waive their right to be there. So they can say, have that meeting without me. I can't be there. But if they want to be there, they have the right to. And usually the notice of the meeting has to be sent to the parent in advance to say, hey, this meeting is scheduled for April 19th. And usually 10 days is the accepted range of reasonable. So giving parents about 10 days notice. Now, that eligibility meeting is when the team comes together to say, does this child qualify for services? Said another way, are they eligible for services under one of these classifications that we just went over, the definition for each of those? So we'll come away from that meeting with either a yes or a no. If the answer is no, then an IEP will not be developed. If the answer is yes, so the child does qualify for services, then the very next step is to develop that individualized education plan. That individualized education plan has to be developed within 90 calendar days of the receipt of the signed consent for evaluation. So all the way back to the beginning of that timeline. Said a different way, the eligibility meeting has to happen within 60 days, but then the school has another 30 days to craft that individualized education plan. That's the school's legal right. So that's their timeline that they have. I would say 95% of the time though, those two things are done together. So eligibility is determined, and because all the same players are already there in the room, the IEP is then developed. So sometimes that meeting can be a really long meeting and it can feel a little overwhelming to families, which I understand. But ultimately, I often think it's a good thing that since everybody is there, everybody agrees that yes, a contract should be developed, that we go ahead and develop the contract right then and there. We kind of expedite that process a little bit. So this is a different graphic, but kind of same thing. So the sequence of the process, and the reason why we're going over this is because it is important that families understand the process. It's a multi-step process. It can be confusing, so the more clarity we can bring, the better. The very first step, starting all the way on the left-hand side of the page here, is the referral. Separate from all of this, there is a process called Child Find. And so these are monies that are specifically set aside for school districts to find kids that might need services. So that process is called Child Find. So if the school reaches out to you and says, hey, your kiddo's struggling with this, or hey, our screenings say this might be an area of concern for your kiddo, they're doing that because they are charged with doing that. It's incumbent upon the school to make sure that they are identifying kids that might need support. If you are coming at this from the place of a parent, though, you don't have to wait on Child Find. You can go ahead and put that referral in. So the referral is put in. We're on here now to the next step. It's received. The school has 60 days. I should say the district has 60 days to respond. And by 60 days to respond, what I mean is for that evaluation to happen. And that evaluation happens after they have that signed parental consent form. After those 60 days, a meeting takes place. You'll get notice of that meeting about 10 days in advance. And that's the eligibility meeting. This is where the team collectively decides, does this child qualify for services? They determine if the child is eligible under one of those categories that I mentioned. 30 days later, or up to 30 days later, it doesn't always take that long, the individualized education plan will be developed. Again, you'll receive notice of this meeting about 10 days in advance. The IEP meeting, the team convenes, and that contract is created. Once that contract is created, it's live, it's valid. The IEP is then implemented. So it usually is the coordinator's job to inform the other teachers that will work with the child what's in the IEP, what isn't the IEP, what types of modifications or accommodations need to be made. If the child's to receive other services like speech services, for example, they'll get those set up and in place. Every year, a child will have their contract looked at. So every 365 days, they'll undergo an annual review of that contract. Excuse me. Separate from that, every 3 years, the whole shebang is redone. The evaluation is redone. The IEP is redone. It's a big process called the reevaluation, and that happens every 3 years, no matter what. Separate from that, you can have more frequent notification of how your child is progressing, and this is called progress reporting. So sometimes this is written into the IEP that the child's progress will be assessed after so many days or so many months or so many minutes of service to make sure that they are gaining in the ways that they can gain. Sometimes it's written that parents get notice of that progress. Sometimes it's not. And even if it's not, that's okay. As a parent, you have the right to request a progress report at any point that you want to. This next slide is an IEP checklist. This is a great one here. There are also a lot of other great ones, and I think there are some really fantastic resources on the Colorado Department of Education website, which is provided for you at one of the very last slides. But in this checklist, it just kind of walks you through again that process, what to expect before the IEP meeting, what to expect at the meeting, what to expect after the meeting. For sake of time, I'm not going to get into the details of this, but I do urge you to come back to this slide later. This is another kind of slide to help you get familiar. All of the forms and the materials that will be used, and you can see here from this list that it is a lot. These are all publicly available forms. So again, if you go on the Colorado's Department of Education website, and again, I have the link for that on one of the ending slides here, all of these forms are available to you. So if you are interested in making sure that you really understand this process, you really understand how this contract will get formed, everything that you need can be reviewed ahead of time. So you should not be presented with any documentation, any forms, anything like that that is unfamiliar to you if you have taken the time in advance to go through all of them. You don't have to. Nobody has the expectation that you have gone through all of these with a fine-tooth comb, but if you want to, they are there for your review. Okay. I mentioned before that I really advise families to have an advocate throughout this process. This could be a personal friend, it could be a consultant, it could be an educational advocate, it could be whomever you want it to be. And certainly here at OBC, we would be happy to serve in that role as an advocate for you. There are some other advocacy groups that we want to bring to your attention though beyond us. El Grupo Vida, which is a Spanish-speaking Latino advocacy group. It's located in Aurora, but the phone number is there. And their mission is to provide advocacy to families that need some support in this process. Another fantastic advocacy group is the ARC of Adams County. They have both Spanish and English-speaking advocates. And they offer a variety of support services, not just in the IEP process, but really through the lifelong process for families with intellectual or developmental disabilities. And they are just such a fantastic organization. Some of the resources that I made reference to. So those graphics that I showed you, there's actually a really lengthy guide. It's called the IEP Procedural Guidance. And the link is there for you. You can go on the Colorado Department of Education website. You could just type in Colorado's IEP Procedural Guidance, but this is the direct link for you here if you're interested. I also linked to the pamphlet for what parents should know about the extended school year. Beyond those two specific things, the Colorado Department of Education website is really well maintained and has record of all of the forms that you would need, who to contact, what the process is. There's a lot of really helpful information. It's a lot to go through. So again, you may choose to use an advocate to help you to go through all of it, but everything is publicly available for you. Outside of that, some other kind of non-Department of Education advocacy links that I'd recommend. Rightslaw.com is a long-standing website that stays pretty up to date on special education law and provides parents with a lot of relevant resources to help advocate for their children. The ARC of Colorado, Disability Law of Colorado, Health First Colorado, all great, fantastic resources. If you feel like this process has not gone as it is intended to, or that your child's rights are being infringed upon, I really recommend the American Civil Liberties Union and specifically the Colorado branch. And again, the link is there for you. And then for families, under certain classifications, the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Board is another really fantastic resource. There are more than just what I have listed here, but these are some that I think are really informative and accurate and well-maintained and useful. And so I gladly share these with you. And that's it. I do apologize. I know I went over the 30 allotted minutes. So for those of you that hung in there with me, thank you for that. I really appreciate you hanging in there with me. And now it's time for questions, if anyone has any.
Welcome to any questions. But overall, I felt like you had the super thorough covering a lot of the different stuff, just the difference between IEPs, 504s, and then like the steps to getting started, the initial evaluation, and then just kind of the overview, the picture of what the whole progression is.
Good, I'm glad to hear that. This was intended to be an overview and kind of an introduction to get people a little familiar with the process. But just like everything that's a process, like the very first time you ride a bike, you're wobbling back and forth. That is a hard thing to do. You do it enough and it becomes second nature. And for better or for worse, I feel like the IEP process is kind of like that. Advocating for your kid is kind of like that. And one of the things that's really cool is that parents who have been through it are often very willing to be a resource for parents who are just starting out. So there's a lot of homegrown experts and advocates that can be resources beyond your professional advocates, and you can get support from other families that have gone through this process.
Cool. Okay, so we do have a question here. Let me kind of read this out. Okay, in this particular environment, from Sasha, in this particular environment, how can I successfully make a case for my child's in-person instead of hybrid education? One simple request with the caseworker resulted in a "sorry, not available" answer.
Yeah. So that's a great question. It sounds like you already have an IEP in place and there are services that are being provided for your child. And those services are already outlined in an IEP. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes.
Okay. I think the biggest thing that you can do, and this is such a tough environment because it's tough for schools, but it's also tough for families, especially when we see our kiddos regressing because they're not getting the services that they used to get or not getting them in the same way, is I think to help to document that your child is struggling. And I know it feels probably terrible that you have to kind of see them fail to better advocate for them. But really, the more that you can document that they are regressing or that they are not making gains or that they are struggling in other ways, the more kind of ammunition, sorry for using that word, but the more kind of evidence you have that services that are being provided for your child presently aren't sufficient. And particularly if the manner in which the services that are being provided is dramatically different than is outlined in your IEP, you have some oomph behind that argument there as well. So I would go back to your IEP and look at what exactly does it say? What are the services that my child is to be receiving? How often? And does it specify the means? Meaning, does it specify that it has to be in person? Most of them probably don't specify that because nobody kind of anticipated this rapid move to online, but it's still worth checking. So to see how is it defined for your child in their specific IEP. And then in addition to that, the more you can document that the services aren't being provided, and because the services aren't being provided, your child is not making their gains, is falling behind, or is struggling in another manner. And then if your reaching out so far hasn't resulted in any movement, I would kind of work up the chain. So first, it sounds like you have contacted your direct treatment provider. I don't know who that direct treatment provider is. They could be somebody from a private practice that the school has contracted to bring in, meaning they are not an employee of the school, but are a private contractor that provides that service. Or it could be that they are an employee of the school. So either one is possible. But if the only person you've talked to so far is the provider, and the private provider has said like, nothing I can do about it, then your next step is you need to talk to your committee chairperson or your IEP team chairperson. So again, that would be specified for you in your individual education plan, who that is and what their contact information is. So I would send correspondence, written correspondence that's timestamped to them that says, per my child's IEP, per my contract, they were to receive X amount of service over X period of time aligned with this specific goal. They've not received this. Here's how my child is struggling. Or they've received this in a different manner and it is insufficient because of X, Y, and Z. and, you know, go in with the spirit of working with that committee person. If that committee person is like, too bad, then your next step is to go to the special ed director for the district that you live in. And that would be available to you on your district's website, who the special education director is. Bring your same concerns to that person in writing. If after that, if they're still like hands up, that's when I would probably move on to an organization like the ACLU or some other legal advocacy organization to say, like, I have a contract. My contract is not being met, and my child is struggling because of it. And they would help you to legally try to resolve that. And usually the way something is legally resolved is payment is provided for you to seek that service privately. But that is a process. And so rather than feeling frustrated at one point, I would just proceed with working through that process. That's probably a longer answer than you were hoping for.
Yeah, that's awesome. Does that answer your question? Okay, awesome. Thank you. It was very helpful.
Good, I'm glad. Do you have any other questions? No. Well, for anybody that's watching this at home, you might be watching this after the fact. And if you are and questions bubble up for you, again, I just want to say that I think the world of OBC is a practice, and they have so many qualified, fantastic people that work there. So whether you go to them to be an advocate or go to them to help refer you to another advocate, I would really reach out to the professionals that you work with to get support, because this is a tough process, and it's tough when you're going through the weeds for the first time. So the more support that you can kind of gather for yourself, the more empowered you'll feel to be that advocate for your child. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you for this amazing talk, and thank you everyone for attending. This is appreciate it very much, and yeah, I'll sign off.
All right, sounds great. Thank you all. Bye.